There is a fascinating detail tucked inside the story of Jacob that almost everyone remembers, yet remarkably few read correctly. A desperate man, actively on the run, lies down in the middle of nowhere and grabs a stone to use as a pillow. When we hear that detail, we think we know exactly what it conveys. We assume it is a portrait of pure misery. Here is a man who is impoverished, hunted, and entirely alone, forced to sleep rough on the unforgiving ground with a literal rock under his head, simply because he had absolutely nothing better. We view the stone as a grim symbol of how far he had fallen. That is the standard sermon we have all heard, and it is not exactly wrong. It is merely incomplete. It means reading only the first half of the story. If the stone were meant to be nothing more than a picture of Jacob's misery, the text would mention it once to set the scene and move on, but it does not. That very same stone comes back. When morning breaks, the man who slept on the rock does something highly unusual with it. He stands it upright. He pours consecrating oil over it. He gives the entire desolate landscape a new name, solely because of that stone. The rock that began the night representing the absolute lowest point of his life, the hard reality under his skull because he possessed nothing else, ends the story as the foundational stone of the house of God. And that is the exact detail worth pausing to consider. The miracle is not merely that Jacob slept on a stone, but that the very stone he collapsed upon in exhaustion is the identical stone he later consecrated. God did not miraculously provide him with a softer place to rest. God did not teleport him to a holier, more comfortable location. The harsh, unyielding thing beneath his head during his darkest moment is the precise object that gets stood upright and declared the house of God. The entire theological weight of the story is hiding in that 90-degree turn. So, let's pick up the stone and examine it, starting with exactly where Jacob is, because the biblical text is very careful to strand him. Jacob is running for his life. He has just ruthlessly stolen his brother's blessing by deceiving his blind, dying father. And in return, Esau has promised to murder him. To save his life, his mother sends him away, fleeing hundreds of miles toward distant relatives he has never even met. The 28th chapter of Genesis picks up the camera on that lonely road. Jacob has absolutely nothing. There are no servants, no protective caravan, and no tent, as far as the narrative tells us. He is simply a man who has burned his own home to the ground and is now walking away from the smoldering wreckage. Then, Genesis does something quietly deliberate. It notes that the sun had set. This is not included merely as a meteorological update or a time marker. This is the man who schemed, grasped, and manipulated until he finally secured the blessing he so desperately wanted. Yet, the very moment he gets his hands on it, the sun goes down on him. He finds himself fleeing through open, dangerous country with a rock for a pillow. He reached the absolute pinnacle of everything his ambition had aimed for, and the prize deposited him here, in the pitch black, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing under his head but the bare earth. So, when the stone is introduced, it genuinely serves as a picture of total collapse. The popular reading gets that part right. This is rock bottom, and the biblical author fully intends for it to feel like rock bottom. However, we must pay close attention to the specific Hebrew word the text reaches for, because it is not the word for a pillow. The original Hebrew does not say Jacob took a stone for a cushion. It says he placed a stone at his Merah-ashot. Merah-ashot is a strange, highly specific term. It is built upon the ordinary Hebrew word for head, rosh, combined with a prefix that transforms it into a location. It literally translates to the head place, the designated spot where the head goes. It does not describe a soft object you rest upon, but rather a geographic zone, the immediate region surrounding a sleeping person's head. This distinction matters deeply. In the ancient Near East, the head place was universally recognized as the most vulnerable spot on a sleeping body. Was the unguarded door to a person's life, whatever an individual placed it there. Merah-ashot communicated everything about how exposed or protected they were while they slept. You can truly feel the weight of that vulnerability by looking at the only other highly memorable figure the Bible associates with a Marashot. Marashot. Years later, in the first book of Samuel, David sneaks into King Saul's military camp under the cover of night. He finds the king fast asleep, with his heavy spear driven firmly into the ground right at his Marashot, his headplace. That is what a powerful, fiercely defended man keeps by his head, a lethal weapon, positioned within arm's reach, ready for war. The king sleeps with his royal and military authority planted directly into the earth beside his skull. And Jacob? At his Marashot. Jacob has a rock. There is no spear, no royal guard, no defensive wall. There is absolutely nothing standing between his unguarded head and the sprawling dark wilderness, except a random stone he picked up off the dirt. The word is not trying to tell you that Jacob was physically uncomfortable. It is telling you that he was entirely defenseless. This is a man asleep at the most dangerously exposed point a human being can occupy, with nothing defending his head but the bare earth condensed into a stone. He has never been more vulnerable in his entire life. Which is, of course, the precise moment heaven decides to break open. Here, the text begins to quietly repeat a specific word, tapping it rhythmically the way Scripture does when it wants you to notice a profound truth without explicitly stating it. The word is Makam, which translates to place. While it is an ordinary word occurring hundreds of times throughout the Hebrew Bible, in these few verses it lands over and over again like a heavy bell being struck. He came to the place. He stayed there because the sun had set. He took from the stones of the place. He lay down in that place. He wakes up and speaks. God is in this place. How awesome is this place? 6 times within a handful of brief sentences. The place, the place, the place. But Makam is not a neutral, empty word here. It derives from a root that means to stand, to arise, or to be firmly established. Bay, Makam, is not just any random patch of dirt. It is a set, established location, a place that is already there, intentionally waiting. This rhythmic repetition shifts the entire meaning of the story. Jacob genuinely believes he has stopped at an arbitrary stretch of wilderness simply because he ran out of daylight. Yet, the text keeps aggressively repeating, the place, as if to inform the reader of a secret Jacob does not yet realize. He did not stumble onto this spot by accident. He was escorted to it. There was already a Makam. Here, an established, standing place of divine encounter. The exhausted, terrified fugitive, who believed he was just picking a random ditch to collapse in, had, in reality, been walked straight up to a door that was already wide open. He just couldn't see it yet, because the night was pitch black, and his heavy head was resting on a rock. Then, he sleeps, and the most famous, enduring image in the entire chapter arrives. An image almost everyone pictures incorrectly. We traditionally call it Jacob's ladder. We imagine a standard ladder, 2 wooden rails with some rungs, leaning precariously against a cloud, with angels climbing up and down like they are using a fire escape. That is the Sunday school picture we inherited, but it is far too small and domestic. The Hebrew word used is sullam, and a sullam is certainly not a household ladder. It derives from a root word that means to lift up, to cast up, or to engineer a raised highway or ramp. It is much closer in appearance to a grand, sweeping stone staircase, the massive kind that scaled the sides of ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats. These were colossal, stepped ramps that the ancient world constructed for the explicit purpose of connecting the earthly realm to the heavens. This is not a flimsy ladder you lean against a wall. It is a massive architectural structure, a raised royal road bridging earth and sky, with its solid foot planted firmly on the dirt and its apex piercing into the heavens. And here is the linguistic detail that should stop you in your tracks. This specific word, sullam. This unique term for the great staircase between heaven and earth appears exactly one time in the entire Hebrew Bible. Once, it is a hapax legomenon, a word that occurs a single time and is never spoken again. Out of the hundreds of thousands of words comprising the Old Testament, the vocabulary for the ultimate bridge between heaven and earth was spent one single time, right here, suspended over the head of a guilty, defenseless man sleeping on a rock. The Bible possessed only one word for this magnificent bridge, and it spent it on Jacob. In the crushing dark, at the absolute bottom of his life, the text says the angels of God were ascending and descending on that grand staircase. Notice the specific order of the movement, because it defies expectations. It does not say descending and ascending, as though heaven's angelic traffic originates up there and occasionally comes down for a visit. It is ascending. First, this implies that the messengers of God were already here. They were already deployed on the ground, already moving quietly through this desolate place that Jacob had assumed was entirely empty. The sweeping staircase did not introduce the angels, it simply made visible a bustling divine traffic that had been running all along. And standing high above it all is God, and he finally speaks. He does not deliver a harsh rebuke. He does not hand Jacob a bill for all his deception and theft. Instead, he offers the covenant. He promises the land, the descendants, and says, "I am with you. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised." The scheming deceiver sleeping on the rock is casually handed the ultimate promise of God, entirely unearned, in his sleep, at the lowest and most exposed moment of his existence. Jacob wakes up terrified, and he utters the line that serves as the true center of the whole narrative. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." Sit with that profound realization, because it is the hinge on which everything turns. He did not know it. The burning presence of God was in this place all along. God was in this Makam, this established place, this open doorway, the entire time. The divine presence was there while Jacob was frantically choosing a rock. It was there while he was lying down in utter defeat. It was there in the freezing dark before the dream began, before any grand staircase materialized, before Jacob felt even a single holy sensation. The dream did not magically bring God to the desert. The dream merely pulled back a metaphysical curtain on a God who was already firmly standing in the one spot Jacob had confidently assumed was the emptiest place on earth, the middle of nowhere, at the end of the worst day of his life. "How awesome is this place," he says. "This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Notice that Jacob is standing on the exact same dirt he fell asleep on. Nothing about the physical ground has changed. Only his eyes have changed. He finally has the eyes to see. And now, watch closely what he does with the stone, because this is the 90-degree turn the entire story has been marching toward. He takes the stone. The text is highly specific. It is the stone, the exact one that had been placed at his Merah-Ashat, his head place, the very rock that had supported his defenseless skull through the long night. He takes it, and he stands it up. The word for the monument he creates is Matzabah, originating from a root that means to stand, to be set upright, or to be stationed. A Matzabah is a standing stone, a pillar, an object deliberately raised from horizontal to vertical, so that it serves as a permanent witness. This is the physical and spiritual hinge of the entire scene, and it happens so quietly you could read past it 100 times without noticing. The stone that lay flat under a broken man, holding up the dead weight of his head in the dark, the horizontal thing, universally associated with lying down, defeat, and exposure, is rotated upright. It is stood on end. It is radically transformed from something you collapse onto into something that points directly toward heaven. Jacob does not throw the ugly stone away in disgust. He does not wander off to find a nicer, smoother, more proper ceremonial altar stone. He takes the exact, jagged rock from his lowest night, stands it up, and pours rich oil over its top. In the ancient Hebrew world, oil was the substance you poured over an object to distinctly set it apart. You poured it over priests, over kings, and over holy artifacts to physically mark them as now belonging exclusively to God. Jacob anoints his makeshift pillow, the stone that had been nothing but a cold, hard necessity just a few hours earlier, is now dripping with sacred oil, standing upright as a permanent marker of the presence of God. It is the exact same stone, carrying the exact same weight, featuring the exact same rough surface, but it has been rotated and consecrated. Then Jacob renames the entire region. Even the old name he wipes away is highly telling. The text notes that the place had previously been called Luz. While the word roughly translates to almond tree, it carries a deeper cultural sense of turning aside. It denotes a place slightly off the main path, a detour. That is exactly what this spot was, a vast nowhere, a place you only ended up in if you had tragically turned aside, a wide patch of absolute nothing on the long way to somewhere else. But Jacob wipes that old identity away completely. He names it Bethel. Bethel is a fusion of two Hebrew words, Beit, house, and El, God, the house of God. The place of wandering and turning aside is instantly transformed into the house of God. The disastrous detour miraculously becomes the actual address of heaven. And the primary object that changed its destiny, the monument standing at the absolute center of this newly named holy site, is a rock that a desperate fugitive had used for a pillow because he literally had nothing else. That is the brilliant architecture of the entire passage, and it is worth stating as plainly as possible. The hard, painful thing under his head did not get removed. It got raised. The lowest, most mundane object in the narrative became the founding stone of the house of God. God did not rescue Jacob from the rock. God consecrated the rock. Now, intellectual honesty requires a brief pause here, because a careful biblical reader will inevitably raise a valid objection, and that objection deserves a fair and historically accurate answer. If you are familiar with the rest of the Bible, you know that much later on, standing stones, these exact matzabot, are strictly banned and outright forbidden. In the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, God explicitly commands Israel not to set up standing pillars. Why? Because the surrounding Canaanites used them extensively in their idol worship, and the physical practice had become thoroughly soaked in violent paganism. So, it is an entirely fair question to ask, was Jacob doing something sinful here? Was he borrowing a pagan religious gesture, setting up the exact kind of stone that God would later aggressively outlaw? The honest, historical answer is no, and the reason boils down to timing. Jacob is operating centuries before the law of Moses even exists. In this patriarchal age, long before Mount Sinai, erecting a memorial standing stone was simply the normal, culturally legitimate way a person marked the geographic spot of a solemn covenant or a profound divine encounter. It was a way of declaring, something undeniably real happened here, permanently. It was perfectly orthodox for its own era. What made standing stones terribly dangerous later on was not the physical stones themselves, but what the surrounding Canaanite cultures ultimately came to do with them. God eventually banned the practice once it had been thoroughly hijacked and corrupted by idolatry. It is a genuine tension within the biblical text, and it is worth being transparent about the fact that the very same object God deeply honors here, he explicitly forbids later. But it is not a contradiction. It was a holy gesture that remained remarkably clean in Jacob's hands, only becoming corrupted when it fell into other hands. The later ban was instituted to protect a vulnerable people who could not be trusted to handle a standing stone the pure way Jacob could. None of that historical nuance diminishes the emotional core of what occurs at Bethel. The stone still magically shifts right in front of our eyes, transforming from the desperate support of a broken man's sleep into the anointed marker of the presence of the living God. That theological architecture holds firm, regardless of what later Levitical law dictates about stone pillars. But there is one final place this stone and this grand staircase inevitably go, and it comes directly from the mouth of Jesus. Once you see the connection, you will never be able to unsee it. Very early in the Gospel of John, Jesus encounters a man named Nathanael. Seemingly out of nowhere, Jesus makes a stunning declaration. You will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus doesn't say ascending and descending on a staircase. He specifically says, on the Son of Man. This is not just a passing, general remark. It is a precise, targeted quotation. Jesus is reaching all the way back across the centuries to Genesis 28, back to the sullam. That one-time-only grand staircase bridging heaven and earth with divine messengers moving up and down its steps. And Jesus firmly positions himself exactly where the staircase used to be. He is boldly declaring, that magnificent thing Jacob saw, the bridge, the raised highway, the singular connection between the hard dirt and the open sky, that is me. I am the true sullam. I am the living place where heaven's traffic finally touches the broken earth. The staircase was never ultimately meant to be a physical structure. It was always pointing to a person, and that person was standing right in front of Nathanael. The imagery of the stone deepens this connection even further. Jacob took a lowly stone, anointed it with oil, and made it the foundational pillar of the house of God. It is no coincidence that the Hebrew word for anointing, for pouring oil to set something apart exclusively as God's, is the exact linguistic root behind the word Messiah, which literally means the anointed one. Throughout the New Testament, Jesus is repeatedly referred to as a stone. He is the stone that the builders carelessly rejected, which ultimately became the chief cornerstone. He is the fully anointed stone upon which the entire house of God is permanently built. He is the immovable foundation of what the Apostle Peter would later call a spiritual house, made entirely of living stones. Jacob's little anointed pillar standing alone at Bethel was merely a rough, preliminary sketch of something the entire Bible would spend the next 2,000 years beautifully drawing out. A rejected, ordinary stone, powerfully anointed, stood upright in the dark, and made the unshakable foundation of the true and final house of God. And there is one last, quiet echo. While it shouldn't be overclaimed as a direct word-for-word translation, the thematic connection is too striking to ignore once you have walked through Bethel. Jacob, the fleeing man who had absolutely nowhere to rest his head but a jagged stone, miraculously becomes the patriarch and ancestor of an entire nation. Centuries later, a direct descendant of his looks at his followers and says of himself, "Foxes have holes, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." This sweeping, multi-generational story began in Genesis with a desperate man who had nowhere to lay his head except a rock in the unforgiving wilderness. And it arrives, at last, at a divine Son of Man who voluntarily chose to have nowhere to lay his head at all, specifically so that he could become the staircase, the anointed stone, and the final house itself. He became the ultimate place where the exhausted, the guilty, and the totally exposed finally get to find lasting rest. This is the moment the narrative stops being solely about an ancient fugitive running through the desert and starts being directly about the rock under your own head today. Most of us walk through life carrying a quiet, deeply rooted assumption, one so ingrained we rarely say it out loud, that God only meets people in the good places. We assume that His holy presence is a reward you arrive at only once you have thoroughly cleaned yourself up, once the immediate crisis has passed, once the ugly sin is fully dealt with, and once you have finally dragged yourself out of a hard season and into a space that is stable and respectable enough for God to actually want to show up. We habitually treat the presence of God like a scenic destination waiting at the very end of a long, grueling road. Consequently, we treat the hard places, the terrifying nights on the rock, the isolating middle of nowhere, the bitter aftermath of our own absolute worst decisions, as mere obstacles in the journey that we have to quickly survive and get past before God will agree to meet with us. We are constantly waiting to reach a better, cleaner place before we ever expect to find him. But Bethel fiercely insists that our logic is completely backwards. Look closely at who Jacob was when he was laying on that rock. He was not a noble hero merely having a tough day. He was a documented liar and a calculated thief, frantically running from the violent consequences of his own selfish scheming. He was at the lowest, most utterly exposed point of a life that he had single-handedly wrecked. If anyone had earned the desolation of the wilderness, it was Jacob. And yet, that is the exact place, that Macom. That middle of nowhere, that head on a rock bottom, where the sky suddenly tore wide open and God spoke nothing but lavish grace and promise over him. Not once did God fold his arms and wait for Jacob to somehow become worth the visit. Not once did God demand that Jacob first drag himself to somewhere holier before the conversation could begin. God came directly to the rock. God came right to the exposed head, to the defenseless, exhausted sleep, stepping directly into the middle of the worst night of Jacob's life. And remarkably, he did not remove the stone. He stood it up, anointed it, and made it the very door to heaven. Which means that the incredibly hard thing under your head right now is not the obstacle keeping God away. It may, in fact, be the exact object he fully intends to stand upright and make holy. That dark season you are deeply ashamed of, that terrible place you ended up that you never meant to go, that metaphorical rock you are sleeping on because right now you genuinely possess nothing softer or safer, that is not just a miserable waiting room outside the house of God. In the profound, upside-down logic of Bethel, that rock might just be the foundation stone of it. God has never once required you to successfully escape the hard place before he would agree to meet you there. He habitually meets his people right on the rock. He has been standing in this difficult place the entire time. The only thing that ever truly changes is whether, like Jacob, you finally wake up from the dark, open your eyes, and realize it. The jagged stone we confidently mistook for a bleak symbol of how far Jacob had fallen turns out, in the end, to be the ultimate symbol of exactly how near God had come. It is the exact same rock, simply viewed twice. Once as bitter proof that he had absolutely nothing, and once as the glorious house of God. You do not have to meticulously smooth out the hard, jagged places of your life before he will meet you there. He actively anoints the exact rock you collapsed on, and he calls it his home. May the God who is already quietly standing in the place you assumed was completely empty gently open your eyes to finally see him there. And may the hard, unforgiving stone currently under your own tired head turn out, when the morning breaks, to be the very gate of heaven. God bless you.